Remember the last 4 minutes of video 5 of 11?
Our supplies had not arrived, so the corporal sent me along as far as Fort Yukon, where I was to hire a boat to take our supplies to Old Crow if they could be found by radio contact at various points along the Yukon River. At this time, I had no thought of the possibility that I would be frozen in on the return trip some 100 miles from home and have to walk through part of these ramparts, which extend from a few miles above the international boundary at New Rampart House to below Old Rampart House, which is in Alaska some 40 miles downstream from the boundary. This area looks like a place where we camped on the way home. Notice the flag giving wind direction as we travel through this swift water. We have reached Old Rampart House. This is the community from a high point of land. By strange coincidence, these Indians, seen in the Hudson's Bay Company graveyard, happened to be the same family with which I was able to store the RCMP supplies when we were subsequently frozen in at Old Rampart House. Here is Paul Ben operating his boat on the return trip. A lot had happened in the short while after leaving the larger boat and barge at Fort Yukon. Now we see a passing group of Indians prepared for cold weather and heading for Fort Yukon. Sights like this were not uncommon on the Porcupine River. Our supplies were located by radio contact at Circle City, Alaska on the Yukon River. We went upstream to get them, but then had a race against time as winter was settling in earlier than usual. I'm pumping the barge because it had started to leak badly. Our outdoor kitchen can be seen nearby. An aircraft flew over, but we had no contact and heard no more of it. One of the beautiful sunset scenes observed before we were forced by ice in the river to pull the boat and barge out of the water and store our supplies. We then walked home.
We then walked home. That casual statement gives no indication of what Constable Wake and Paul Ben actually went through to get home. There was a lot going on here for Constable Wake. We just saw that he had come down the Porcupine River to Fort Yukon, Alaska, as a single man in late August 1946, searching for the missing RCMP supplies. In video 9 of 11, we learn that Constable Wake met Ann Weitzel there, a young missionary nurse working at the Hudson Stuck Memorial Hospital. They met on Wednesday, probably September 4th, 1946, and by that Saturday were engaged. They were married a year later in Minneapolis, Minnesota on September 6th, 1947. Once the supplies were located 80 miles away in Circle City, Alaska, Constable Wake had to hire a boat to pick them up. Paul Ben and his boat were hired, and off the two of them went, first up the Yukon River to Circle City, Alaska, to pick up the supplies, and then back down the Yukon River, past Fort Yukon, and back up the tributary Porcupine River to return to Old Crow. Constable Wake described this arduous journey home in a letter he wrote to his new fiancée. The contents of this letter were the source material for a booklet his widow, Ann Wake, wrote that was named An Incredible 100-Mile Journey. Unfortunately, the very first portion of this letter has been lost, but Anne supplied the beginning of the story as she had remembered it being told to her.
Jim Wake had been commissioned by his senior RCMP officer, Corporal Kirk, to try to track down the shipment of winter supplies destined for Old Crow, Yukon Territory. The last steamboat of the season had come and gone, its terminal shipping point being Fort Yukon, Alaska. From thence, shipments bound for the smaller outlying villages had to be transported by smaller craft. The shipment was located at Circle City, some 80 miles upstream from Fort Yukon. During the return trip to Fort Yukon, the long, narrow boat struck a sandbar due to the very shallow water that late in the season. The bow had sprung a leak then and was repaired with tin sheathing, although there was still a slow leak, which meant water had to be frequently pumped out. It was September, very late in the shipping season, when Jim and his guide began the long journey home to Old Crow. Soon after leaving Fort Yukon, which is on the Yukon River, they traveled up the Porcupine River, which is noted for its ramparts, canyon-like cliffs where the river flows most swiftly. Winter was settling in. Freeze-up had begun. Our travelers were having increasing difficulty fighting their way upstream against the swift-moving slush. They labored each day until it was almost too dark to find a spot to moor the boat for the night. In the morning, they would have to chop away the newly formed ice in order to reach the less solid, swift slush bearing down upon them.
With the foregoing introduction furnished by his widow, we now come to the remaining portion of the written account by Constable Wake to his wife-to-be.
We got aboard and went to the other side, where the water was not so swift, and tried to pole upstream, thus giving the motor a bit of assistance. But it was to no avail. The slower water was too shallow, and to get in water deep enough to operate the prop took us into water both too swift to pole and too swift for the power we had. It was impossible to line from the side owing to the nature of the river at this point. The launch had started to leak badly, and we realized there was nothing to do but to either take the load over in smaller loads or go back to Old Rampart and just bring the fresh stuff in the launch and leave the other stuff and the barge after pulling it out of the water. Paul decided to turn around and go back downstream, but he misjudged the action of the water. I saw what was going to happen but could do nothing. The current took us broadside and carried us headlong to the opposite shore. I ran up front and had a pole ready to try and take up the jar a little bit, but my efforts were futile. The barge struck the rocks full force. Paul had jumped ashore, and I looked back and saw that the launch had partially broken away from the barge, and we were being carried on downstream to be dashed against the rocks in yet another place. Paul was apparently in a funk, so he told me afterwards. So I am glad I hollered to him to rev up his motor and get out into midstream. This he did, and we managed to miss hitting again. I had expected to see everything go under and was prepared to swim for it, and had my eiderdown handy to use as a life preserver. As it turned out, the tin sheathing took the full force of the blow and the barge was not damaged. As we drifted downstream, Paul and I moored the boat and barge side by side, and afterwards returned to Old Rampart, feeling very dejected, but thankful we had not had worse trouble. Not knowing how the ice would run, we first decided to unload the launch and part of the barge and see how things were the next morning. We took our sleeping robes up to the house, and after supper we took things easy, retiring early, for we were very tired. I was getting ready to stretch my robe on the floor when our host told me I was to have the bed. I had an enjoyable sleep in my underclothes this night, but found myself embarrassed the next morning when the kids insisted on watching me get dressed. We put sheathing on the front of the launch and loaded it with the fresh stuff, then unloaded the rest of the freight on the barge. This took most of the day, and as the ice was still running thickly, we decided it was not safe to take a chance to continue upstream. The next day was spent packing, hauling or carrying the freight up to the house and their cache. Fresh stuff and other perishables were put in the house. The following day, Wednesday, found us still packing stuff up to the cache and also pulling the boat and barge out of the water. Since the day before, the ice had been coming in large sheets, and it was very evident that this was it. There would be a jam and the river would freeze up. That is why we had pulled the boat and barge out on Wednesday. We had to cut the ice all around them before we could move them, and it was a slow, tiresome procedure. We were so exhausted by the time we got the barge out and the launch just out that we quit for the night. The next day, Thursday, we found the water had backed up from a jam down below, and the launch was nearly frozen in again. It did not take too long to put the barge and boat where Paul wanted them. Then we finished packing the remainder of the freight up to higher ground. It all went up with the exception of the gasoline and drums. They were too heavy and awkward to roll up the steep grade, so Paul is going down sometime this winter to haul them further up by dog team. I had Mrs. John make me a couple of pairs of snow boots, and we made other preparations to continue our journey. Friday morning, we finished picking out what we would need for the hike. I had no pack, so they gave me a gunny sack and some canvas made into straps. Paul borrowed a pack from the boy, Peter David. I took, besides the clothing I was wearing, a pair of overalls, my lined parka, flashlight, a few letters which were in the mail sack we were transporting, extra socks, extra snow boots, shaving kit, canvas sheet, extra mitts, a cup and spoon, and a little grub. Paul had similar stuff with the exception of the mail and flashlight. Oh yes, he carried the frying pan and the rifle. I carried the tea pail and a double-bitted axe. I hadn't gotten very far when the canvas straps of my pack started to show how old they were. I had to discard them and use rope. This was unsatisfactory, for it cut into my shoulders, but what else could be done? About 10 miles upstream, we sighted a band of caribou and came within 150 yards before they turned and fled. Later we caught up to part of them. We were walking on the river ice then, and they started walking downstream. Very soon they passed not 50 yards from us in single file, then turned and watched us continue. We did not shoot, of course. What could we have done with a quantity of meat at that time? Also, we were in foreign territory. We stopped at Rapid River for a well-earned rest around 4 p.m., cooked a light meal, and continued on, arriving at Campbell River by dark. We stopped where there was a large pile of driftwood and made open camp just inside the edge of the trees. We cut spruce boughs to lie on, sorted out the wood, and kept a big fire going most of the night. A strong, cold north wind came up, and we put in a sleepless night. Although we rolled up in our canvas sheets, there was no warmth, even from the fire at the distance we had to remain from it. I found it very chilly as my clothes were all damp from perspiration, and the cold air almost chilled me to the marrow. The next morning, Saturday, we continued, and the wind became so strong and biting that when we stopped to make tea at dinner time, we both put on all the clothes we had. Paul had his fur parka, and I had overalls and my lined parka. This was rather cumbersome to walk in, but very necessary. We were exceedingly tired, especially since we had not had a good rest the previous night. We stopped a lot, probably every 2 hours. About 3 p.m., Paul shot a rabbit, and we stopped and cooked it right away. I didn't fancy eating it in case the too fresh meat would give me dysentery, which often happens to white people when eating freshly killed meat. It started to snow heavily, and very soon we could hardly see across the river. It was good to get to New Rampart House around 4 p.m. All along this 35 miles, we had been clambering over rocks of all sizes. Sometimes we had to pick our way along rocky cliffs which rose directly out of the river, the ice being in some places not safe enough for us. We were lucky that all along that stretch we did not have to go up over the top of the ramparts and around. We found the river frozen from directly above Old Rampart to near Campbell River. There were small patches here and there of open water. From Campbell River to a short distance above New Rampart, the river was running free. Near New Rampart, in fact right in front of it, our way brought us to a steep cliff which rose sheer from the river. We hated to go up and over, so took a chance on the ice, even though it did crack under us as we walked along our way. Gosh, the sweat sure comes out of one at such times. Ostruds were at New Rampart when we arrived. They were surprised when we turned up, although they were expecting us sometime. Mrs. Ostrud had a very sore lip. She said it was chapped. The next morning it was swollen even more and was a purplish color. Not having medicine along, and knowing she had some sulfa tablets, I advised her to turn a few into powder, then make a paste by adding some Vaseline, and put that on. When it is colder and the river has frozen over, they are going over to their camp near the head of Black River. I expect to patrol over there next March. We had 2 meals there on Saturday and really made up for what we had missed. They had no meat other than rabbit, but she certainly could roast the rabbit in a most delicious manner. I enjoyed it fully. Not having any blankets, they fixed us up. They gave Paul a bunch of blankets and me an eider-down robe that was in the making. They stretched out our tent on the floor and also put some caribou skins on it, so you can imagine that we were nice and cozy. The next day, Sunday, we continued. It was still snowing, but after having breakfast and getting some bannock and other grub, we started out. The snow was deep, and it wasn't long before my pants were soaking wet up to and above my knees. Luckily, there was a strong south wind, and it was not very cold. We had to cross to the other side of the river a couple of times in the morning in order to get around more of those bad places. In the afternoon, we were completely stumped on several occasions. One time, we went across even though there was open water in many places. We took a chance because we wouldn't have to climb so high on the other side in order to get around the bad places. Having gone around and continuing downstream a short distance, we found another place we couldn't get around, and rather than go up and over, higher than ever this time, we decided to take a chance on going across again. This time the ice was so thin, we cut long poles to carry in case we went through. Nearly every direction we took, the ice was too thin to carry our weight, especially me. However, we didn't want that high climb, so we took the chance, even though we could feel the ice giving way under us. We made it over. It was getting close to dark, and there was one more bad place between us and where Paul wanted to camp for the night. This time, we have to go up the hard way. I found it so darn slippery and steep that I had to pull myself from tree to tree. Little ones, too, only about an inch or two in diameter. Up on top, the snow was really quite deep. By this time I was soaked to the skin anyway, so it didn't matter. However, I did have one of my nightmares come true at this time. I had had a bad dream a long time ago in which I had to follow a ridge and where I had to be careful not to fall off either side. Well, in order to get down from where we were, we had to follow such a sharply inclined ridge. I straddled it, fearing that if I walked naturally I might lose my balance and slide down one side or the other. Although I would have only slid a few 100 feet before getting to the tree line, I did not relish the thought. We finally got down safely, and by this time I noticed Paul was limping. He said his foot was sore and he could hardly walk. We started looking for a camping place, and I found a great cave-like hollow in a cliff. At first Paul didn't care to sleep there, in case the heat made the rock fall. My arguments made him assent. During that day the wind was blowing strongly from the west, and so the weather became mild toward night-time. By the time we got our campfire going, it couldn't make up its mind which way it wanted to blow. Finally, it blew from the north. Being soaked nearly to the hips by the time camp was reached, the first thing I did was to take off all my clothes and put on the overalls that I had extra, and my lined parka. Our supper consisted of a piece of dry moose meat stuck on a stick, some bannock, butter, and some tea. David John had given us a few chunks of dry moose meat, and we had enough for one meal on the first day out, 2 on the second, and 1 on the third. It was always cooked in the same fashion, no tools. After supper I hung my clothes over the fire and dried them out and put them back on. They were smoked beautifully, but nevertheless they helped me get a better rest by being dry. The next day, Monday the 7th, we started out. About a mile along, Paul said his feet were hurting him so much that he didn't believe he could go much further. I had offered to let him wear my inner soles before, but he wouldn't consider it. Now I insisted that he put them on, so we sat down. I took them off, and he put them on. That helped him some, but from then on we couldn't go very far without having to rest. After about another mile, and I had to carry both the axe and the rifle in his canvas sheet, we kept on and decided to have an early dinner as an excuse to get a long rest. He had been using 2 sticks for support while walking. Then we continued doggedly on, and finally passed the end of the ramparts. We could see Old Crow Mountain once again. My, it looked close, but we knew it would take all of 4 days or longer to get there at the rate we were traveling. Plus, we only had 1 can of soup left, as well as a handful of broken crackers and a little tea. As soon as we were out of the ramparts, we took a portage where the winter trail cuts off miles of the river, but we thought it would be a great change for us. Well, it was a change, for the mile of rounded black boulders and rocks that we had to go through took more out of us than 10 miles along the river. On reaching the river, it was a case of taking a chance on the ice again. There was only one place, about 100 yards wide, that looked to be frozen all the way over, and we carefully crossed it. On reaching the river, we could see Jack Frost's cabin about a mile downstream. I was very vexed with Paul over this, for he knew that I wanted to make a stop over there, and I believe he deliberately took me out of the way so that we wouldn't stop over. Not knowing the country so well, I never knew exactly where the cabin lay from where we were on entering the portage, but I expected him to take me to it. The river wasn't frozen over there in front of the cabin, but I would have waded across regardless, as it is not too deep along that stretch. Paul by this time was completely exhausted, but I made him see that it was no use trying to continue without a rest, so we headed for Frost's. It was like retracing valuable ground we had so painfully covered, but I felt it was worth it. On nearing a bunch of willows on the river bank, a quarter of a mile downstream, I noticed something moving, and soon saw it was a man. I thought he had made a kill there and was skinning the animal. I soon found out that he had mistaken us for caribou and was actually stalking us. It was Frost's eldest son. Of course he is wise enough not to shoot anything before he knows what it is, but just the same, it sort of sent a chill down my spine. He, Donald, took Paul's pack and the rifle, and in what seemed to be ages we arrived at the cabin, and were soon having a hearty meal of hamburgers and tea. I told them what my plans were, i.e. to lay over for a day and then continue to Old Crow, so they said we could sleep in their tent, and they supplied us with some sleeping robes. Boy, this was good. That night I heard the message for me over KFAR, telling me that Laverleys may be along any day, and I was to be on the lookout for them and make a signal fire and mark out a landing if possible. Next day was so cloudy there was no possibility of a plane, so we just laid around. I found a good murder mystery and spent most of my time reading that. Donald offered to go to Crow with us, taking his dog team. This was keenly appreciated. The following day, Wednesday, we started out about 8:30 a.m. and were able to ride the first mile or so, but from there on we took turns. Paul was given preference on account of his feet, but the fact that we had no packs to carry while walking made a tremendous difference. The trail was not broken, but the snow was not too deep. Our biggest difficulty was when we were forced to travel along the river. This was extremely dangerous in many places, and we had to proceed with utmost caution. We stopped for dinner about 17 miles from Old Crow by river, perhaps 9 miles by trail. Continuing, we soon came within sight of Crow. Paul found his mother camped at the end of our last portage, so he stayed behind, and Donald and I continued. Everyone was happy to see me, and the Indians came out to shake hands, glad that I had made it okay. Kirks were especially happy to see me again, and it goes without saying that they were pleased to learn that our stuff was okay. Some of the spuds may be touched, but on the whole, I believe everything is okay. It was swell to get a hot bath and a change of clothes and feel at home once again. My cabin sure looked good to me, and Kirk's cabin looked like a millionaire's establishment. All along the way from Fort Yukon, my thoughts of you were constant. It was this that carried me along so well, not to underrate the many prayers that were said for me there. Once before, I had a short experience by myself where I was out overnight without blankets or matches and little food, and being so exhausted I didn't care whether I lived or died. That is no idle boast. I actually did feel that way. Earlier that night I had scared off a bear, but later on I wouldn't have cared what happened. So you see, I really know what it means to have found the girl I have always prayed for.
One of the beautiful sunset scenes observed before we were forced by ice in the river to pull the boat and barge out of the water and store our supplies. We then walked home.
That walk home from Old Rampart House, Alaska to Old Crow, Yukon was indeed an incredible 100-mile journey. My brother Jim, my sister Sylvia, and I, and all of our children and grandchildren are immensely grateful that he completed that trek.